This demonstration is to teach you one of many ways of creating a glass shading network. Now this type of glass shading network, the reason why I'm going to demonstrate this type is that it will expose you to a certain type of node called the sampler info node, and we will connect it using the connection editor window. Now, the sampler info node does the following. It's used most commonly to disguise seams of a texture. It samples each pixel's information relative to the camera, the material object location relative to the camera. It reads the materials and objects orientation, tangencies, and normals. The facing of the normals will tell the camera what side to read, and it is considered a general utility node. That's how it is able to disguise the seam of your textures. So what I'm going to do right now is I'm going to create a brand new shader. You want to create a type of shader that has the ability to have a high reflectivity and transparency. I'm going to use a Phong Yi. However, a blend or a typical Phong will work as well. I'm going to hold down my right mouse button, assign new material, Phong Yi. I'm going to go ahead and give this a name. Okay, so let's just say I want to create this glass. I want it to be a blue color. So I'm going to click on my color picker, and I'm going to correctly select the type of blue hue I'm going to try to mimic here. We can always come back and adjust this later on. Now right now all you're going to see is just a solid blue object. But part of something that is glass is that it needs to obviously be transparent. So what I'm going to do is, in the transparency, I'm going to click on the Create Node button. And in here, I am going to attach a ramp procedural. Now, a procedural texture is a texture that is created in Maya by Maya. And with procedurals, what we need to remember when it comes to transparencies is that with procedurals, white is transparent. Any other values in between black and white are opaque. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to click on ramp, and that will apply a ramp into my transparency. Let's take a look at the shader as I start adjusting this. Okay, so you can see it's somewhat transparent and opaque in certain areas depending on the value of that color. I'm going to come back to my transparency, and being that white is transparent, I'm going to click on my ramp and I'm going to select my very first color here. And I'm going to scroll down and I'm going to change that selected color to white. Okay, so you can see that now that area is completely transparent. I'm going to go to my mid value here and I'm going to change it to the value of blue that I want to be placed at that point. Let's just say somewhere about there. And again, you can always come back and adjust these colors, and you can click and drag on them to change their positions. You can even click inside the ramp to add extra positions of color to add multiple different types of values of color. So I'm going to scroll down here to the bottom. I'm going to change that red to a deep blue, a dark blue. Okay. So the most transparent area will be my white. Now when your values start to become somewhere in between a black, a very dark range, and a very light range, all those values in between here will be opaque. When it comes to the ramp, you can also change the type of the ramp. Notice how my sample changes here, so that changes the type of the position of the ramp. You can also change the interpolation to smooth, which will create a smoother transition between your values, or linear. Okay, so if I render this out right now with the way that our shading network looks, okay, you're going to notice a hard seam down the shader network. So let's just go ahead and render that out. This may take a few moments. being that we are using ray tracing shadows. Alright, you can already see what I'm talking about. So if I zoom in here in my render, you're going to see this really hard seam, and that is the seam of the ramp texture that we're seeing here. Well, obviously that does not look realistic, so we can go back to the hypershade. And again, the reason why we're using a ramp to control the transparency is because when you look at glass, glass has a variety, a wide range of color values that make up a glass. So what you can do is you can add in multiple ranges of color values so you can create a really complex, elaborate looking piece of glass. But right now we need to focus on disguising this seam. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to create something called a sampler info node, and that is considered a utility node. So in my hypershade, I'm going to go to utilities. You can scroll down and find the sampler info node, or if you have difficulty finding it, you can always type it up here in the search bar. So sampler info node, here we go. I'm going to go ahead and click on it and create. Now we need to establish a connection between the ramp texture and the sampler info node. So I'm going to middle mouse, hold my middle mouse button, click and drag and drop it on top of the ramp, let go and hit default. That will then pop up my connection editor, because we're going to do some more advanced connections rather than just the ones you would find in the regular attribute editor of the shader. So on the left, I'm going to click on facing ratio, and that is from the sampler info node. Now for the ramp texture, we want to connect it to the U and the V coordinates. The reason why is your piece of geometry has two directions. That's a U direction and a V direction. So we need to correspond to that. And again, that's because of this here, sampler info node. It's going to read the material and the object's orientation, tangencies, and normals of the geometry. That's how it's disguising our texture seams. If you don't see either one of these selections, click on that column, either right or left, whichever, and make sure Show Hidden is turned on. Once these are highlighted, that means there is a connection established. You can close the connection editor, and now you can see in our shading network, those are now connected. You can hover your mouse over top of that, and you can see that it is connected. You can also look at the shader itself and notice that that seam is now missing. Now, being that this takes a long time to render, I am just simply going to render part of it so we can see that that seam is gone. Okay. You can see the seam of that ramp texture is gone. Now once you've done further manipulation with the position of your colors, adding in different values inside of your ramp texture, you should be able to create a really, really lovely glass shader. And again, remember your light's intensity, turning on your ray trace shadows, all of these can have a strong effect over your shader network and the way that your surface will look in the end. So we can take a look at a finalized glass shader network here. And you can see that is how you create a really simple glass shading network using the ramp texture plugged into your transparency and disguising the seam by using a sampler info node. Now bear in mind there's other things you can adjust to help control your glass's appearance, and that's your reflectivity, your highlight by controlling the highlight size and the specular color, the color of the highlight. So adding in that wide variety of different color ranges in your ramp texture to control the transparency can give you a really nice glass shader effect.